It's a great pleasure, to be on this platform talking to, a large number of our own participants and, and younger generation on this important issue. So, thanks to you, I've been able to do. So let me. Sanjay, appreciated. Let me just get the voice done. Okay. Yeah, so if my voice is clear now, I'll go ahead. Sanjay, am I fine?
Yeah, you are fine now.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Somehow it requires that plugging in over and over again. So yeah, so I was thanking Sanjay. Now this is an initiative which he has started on his own, and it has helped us to kind of maintain our sanity and prevent an organizational depression, as it were. Given this massive crisis that the whole world faces. So let me start off, without too much of preliminary. Now we all have experienced the the crisis. We all know what the situation is. What I'll do is I'll try and focus first on a few facts, just to be sure, that we are on the same page. Okay, and then I'll come on to argue the nature of this crisis and that it's a extraordinarily serious matter, and that perhaps for India we seem to be heading certainly not the right way, but perhaps completely orthogonal to what we should be doing. And that's my worry, and that is what makes me take this extra effort to talk to as many people as one can. Now, of course, some of these ideas have indeed been there in the papers as well and in the media. So what you can expect really is an integration of these, as well as a certain perspective which may be not quite popular. I mean, may not be quite evident, but is very important given the current situation, because it's a throwback actually to several situations in the past, and there is a lot of learning which policymakers and governments could have amassed and used, and unfortunately you don't see that so very well with the two major actors in the whole space of revival and resolution, which is the government and then of course the central bank. Okay. So let me start off by giving you a lowdown on, you know, the current economic situation and just before the great COVID crisis, as I would like to call it, following the global financial crisis. So I would call it the great COVID crisis or the global, you know, uh, COVID crisis, whichever way you want to put it. Okay. So I'll use data which is not controversial. There's a lot of GDP data available, but they don't lead you to a right perspective, because there can be controversies, there can be problems with that. So let me start by saying that the index of industrial production, which is fairly reliable because the physicality of that index, you know, it has shown a massive fall to about point minus 8%. However, it was rising actually, and it had reached some level of 5% before the crisis, and now, of course, my guess is it would have fallen. Okay, so the index had been slowing down almost, from let's say 18 onwards. It was never very fast even before. Okay, now the capital goods sector shows the worst performance. Okay, uh, about minus 18%, growth in late one of the months of late 2019, when it had completely slowed down in that sense, braked very hard, and then of course a bounce to a minus 10% on the eve of the crisis. Okay, now these are high frequency data because that's the only thing that will allow us to get some understanding of what the COVID crisis is all about in India in terms of the data. Auto, as we all know, has had a huge and a precipitous fall over the last 2 years. When the growth was under 20%, I think it reached something like minus 30%. You know, from a kind of a seeming bounce post 2000, post actually the demonetization in early 2018, and then from then on it had just kind of taken a trajectory all the way down. Okay, and today my guess is it's probably at about minus 45%. Okay, yeah. So auto container movements, show a great collapse. Exports show a collapse to minus 35%. Okay, electricity generation, falls to zero growth for quite some time, and it's probably about minus 35%. Capacity utilization is well below 45%. Okay, that means the kind of PLF, the plant load factors, are running at an average of 45%. That's amazing. That means there is so much of capacity which was created which is not being used, and quite obviously so. So, when we had that kind of that instantaneous shutdown, which the PM called, when we were asked to light the diyas and so on, at that time the demand was expected to come down from around around the base demand at that time. The previous day, let's say, was about 100,000 megawatts on a total capacity of 250,000 megawatts. Okay, so there the demand, because of the switching off of lights, was expected to go down by about 15 to 20,000 megawatts, but it actually went down to about 30,000 megawatts. Mercifully, of course, the whole thing was handled very well by our engineers, and there's no shock to the system and so on. So that gives you a sense of, and the detailed data is there. So what it tells you is that in any case, the demand was actually pretty okay. Now come to inflation. Inflation has been rather low, but depends on how you measure it, how you want to look at it. So the core inflation, core is the non-food, non-fuel inflation. That means the steady inflation, which doesn't waver much, and which is usually the target of central bankers and governments and so on. You don't want that inflation to go high at all. Okay, so that inflation had been falling. Okay, and it had reached low levels of around 4%, which I think is pretty low, for pretty okay for India, and had come down to maybe about 3.5%. So it was as low as that. However, the overall inflation and food inflation has been highly volatile, ranging from minus what 8-9% to plus 8-9%, and pulling along with it overall inflation, because food has a very high and unduly high weight in India's CPI, and therefore if you look at overall inflation, you're essentially going to see food prices. Okay, and you probe a little deeper, you're going to see onion and tomato and dal prices moving up and down. Okay, so that's what actually happens. So food inflation has been lower. Real interest rates have been quite high. Okay, compared to the world, they have never been lower than 3% all the way from 2014-15, and sometimes they have even reached 4.5%. The real interest rate, as you know, is the core inflation, as I've measured it, minus the yield on government on corporate bonds. Okay, which is the interest on corporate bonds, AAA rated, minus the actual inflation. Okay, minus the inflation is the real inflation. So the real inflation has been as high as 3%. Okay, real interest rate. Sorry, the real interest rates. What it means is that the bond rates, okay, particularly of the corporate bonds, but also of government bonds, have been extraordinarily high in India. In other words, the interest rates have been simply too high. Yeah. Now, let me go on to the monetary side, and these are data which goes beyond. I mean, there's no controversy on this data. Yeah. So let me say this. So the yields on government bonds, actually rose during 2018, reached as high as 8.5%, and it's only after the new governor came that the 10-year bond yields began to fall. But they rose again in 2019, thanks to the mess up, the NBFCs and that kind of crisis. They rose to about 7.25%, and since then it has been falling. But these are on government bonds to about 6.575%, and even today on government bonds it's rather high if you take the 10-year yield. Okay, rates are absurdly high in relation to global markets, and even with reference to inflation in India, which I already talked about, that the real rates are positive. Okay, the corporate bond yields have been way above the government bonds. Okay, and but they have been falling, but only since late 2018. Okay, the spreads meaning the gap between them and government bonds have been quite high. For AA bonds, the fall has happened only from 2019. Okay, and again they have remained high. So the net result is that the uncertainty in the financial markets have gone up quite significantly. So I've used a measure of uncertainty, and that shows that there has been a huge increase in the uncertainty in the financial markets. Okay, uh, yeah. So this is largely because of non-action or not the right kind of action by the central bank. Okay. Now, on the back of this, right from, let us say, a fairly early period of around 2011-12, M3 growth has been falling, you know, certainly from 2019 early to reach low levels of around 9.5% to 10.5, 10.25%. So the M3, that is the money supply growth, is low but not too bad. However, reserve money has fallen by around, witnessed a fall of around 8%. And, since the COVID crisis, the liquidity shortage in the economy has dramatically increased, because essentially what the RBI did not do, which is, I would think, rather elementary, is that when there is a massive capital outflow on account of a crisis like this, because global capital markets will fly to so-called safety, and that is to the you know to the US, and therefore there'll be a dollar withdrawals from India, and this was masked, of course, by certain other inflows which took place. But the RBI perhaps took the view that the UTI, LIC, and the institutional buying of stocks or intervention in the market was good enough. But actually, there is a disconnect, because the intervention in the by the UTI, etc., can prop up the stocks, but not necessarily, you know uh, create liquidity, because then the only way it could have been done was, the central banker did what is called open market operations. That means bought government bonds en masse to increase the domestic credit in the economy. So as you know, domestic credit plus the holding of government bonds is equal to the base money or the reserve money, on the basis of which the money supply actually goes up. Okay. So this is a period in which, in any case, the money multiplier was falling even before the COVID crisis. So what it means is that the high-powered money, or what the money of the RBI, in a sense, okay, H, or M naught, or whatever you want to call it, reserve money, base money, etc., that should have increased much, much more rapidly, so that the liquidity in the system was maintained. Okay. And if you put these together, what it means is that the financial sector uncertainty has been rising very sharply from mid 2019 onwards. It had fallen from fairly high levels in the past to those levels, and now it had begun to rise from mid 2019. And then the crisis actually hit us. Okay. So here I have, some growth. Now you can see that there was a growth revival in the very last month before the crisis. That means in February. Okay, led largely by the infrastructure, but mostly by the intermediate goods sector, government spending on, the roads and that sort of thing. But that has now come to a standstill, and we know that there has been a precipitous fall. There's nothing. So it's sad for India that just after such a long time, when the economy was beginning to revive, we were hit so hard with the crisis. Okay. Yeah, so I'll skip this. This is, you can see the uncertainties have been rising, as you can see, in the market, and particularly after 2009, they have 2019, they have risen. Now here is where you can see the inflation. Now, if you look at the core inflation, okay, you can see that it's fairly steady and having fallen here over this period, and having fallen over a much longer period than a rise over this period. And but if you look at the actual inflation and food inflation, they're literally coterminous. That means the actual inflation is being determined by food. So although food as it is has a very large share, which is unduly large, that needs correction, 45%. And more importantly, given the extremely high volatility of food, that's what is driving the entire inflation. So when you do inflation targeting, uh, you're targeting essentially onion and tomato prices, over which no central banker can have any kind of control. So it's a will of a wisp, really, in that sense. Okay. Now the other thing to notice is, there is also an agrarian crisis which was building up in the back of this, and elements of that we saw. Okay. Now, of course, there are many elements to the agrarian crisis, but for which had been building up over a much longer period, even going back to the Congress days and so on. What I'll focus on is a sudden shift in the terms of trade. Okay. Now, agriculture did rather well over the entire period since 2003-4. Okay, over a long period, even during the global financial crisis and later. However, the terms of trade had been improving for agriculture. That means agricultural prices were rising faster than other goods prices, putting some money into the poor, into the farmers, and so on, and giving them a sense of, participation in the economy, positivity, and so on. Okay, but this was rudely kind of interrupted in 2015 when the demand side for agriculture just collapsed. Okay, and therefore the food prices just fell off. Food and agriculture prices fell. Now, there, as you can understand, there is a low price elasticity of demand. So, when there is a small excess production, even the prices can collapse. And that collapse in prices, particularly of vegetables, onions, dals, and so on, made something like over 20 commodities reach market prices well below the so-called procurement prices. In other words, the kind of support, minimum support prices did not make any sense because government was hardly procuring, and therefore there was a income crisis in the agricultural sector. So they were producing and feeding, or FCI was buying and wasting, but their own incomes were not rising anymore after about 2015-16. Okay, so the last several years it has been pretty low. Now you'll see something even funnier, and I'll come to that in a moment. Okay, yeah. So the other thing that you see is that the growth rate of exports had come down, that I've talked about. Yeah. Now this is something which I've talked about, that the yields. Now here you can see that the interest rates have been very high for quite some time, and they only began to fall in this period. They again rose and only fell in this period, and now there is a crisis that has happened. Okay. Yeah. So okay. Now, you know, let me go on to features which were already there in the economy. And I think that is important to recognize. Okay. There has been a major slowdown. Now, why is it? Even as early as 11, 12, when the fiscal stimulus, given the great financial crisis, which were a good, excellent response to the fiscal, to the global financial crisis happened all over the world, including by China, but particularly China and India, and both gave massive fiscal stimulus, as a result of which the growth was upheld to about 7.5% for about 3-4 years, 3 years at least. Now, when the fiscal stimulus was withdrawn, and inevitably it had to be withdrawn because you didn't want to sustain it. Okay. Unfortunately, the RBI at the same time came out and, instead of giving a monetary stimulus when the fiscal stimulus was withdrawn, actually monetarily tightened, and that raised interest rates, which was the graph that I showed you. Then it slowly came down, when the growth began to fall down. However, the taper tantrum emerged around 14 and the R14-15, and the RBI, instead of actually responding correctly to it, ended up willy-nilly, increasing interest rates in a very big way. So for quite a while, there was this will of the wisp of inflation. That means the RBI was chasing inflation targets, and therefore, at a time when the inflation was actually falling, but seeing the wrong inflation, and therefore, there was a slowing down effect. Similarly, if you look at, let's say, Modi won the first 2 years, the Modi government spent very little. In fact, it spent much less than what was budgeted because things was highly centralized and departments did not have the kind of confidence to go at unless the PMO had seen it or been conscious about it. Okay. NREGs, of course, as everybody knows, was constrained. Now, there were demonetization and delayed effects of that. I won't dwell too much on it. Essentially, what we said is that the demonetization had a hit immediately on the output. However, it was not too bad because most people felt positive about it, and so the incomes of MSMEs and informal sector, while they fell, their consumption spending did not. But the consumption spending began to fall in 2000 and late 2018. Once they realized that permanent slowdown had happened. Okay. So similarly, GST, great initiative, great thing. However, integrates the home market and all that. However, it has a demand depressionary effect because it raises the effective tax rate. So had it been combined with a massive reduction in the GST rates, government revenues would have been higher, because the elasticity is actually higher, very good, and the you know the demand depressionary effect of GST would not have taken. So it's not trade wars or negative petroleum shocks, but much of the slowdown which happened prior to the COVID crisis was essentially government created. Okay, and government created, and delays. Okay, and are both government and RBI created. Okay, now if you know, there has been a cycle of low growth and NPAs which kind of ruined the financial sector. I won't dwell again too much on it. I'll just put up a slide and you can see what we mean. Okay, so if there is low growth, NPAs will rise. Okay, if NPAs rise, lending is affected, which in turn creates low growth. Okay, bad lending creates high NPAs, lending is affected, and therefore low. So these were the two factors: low growth caused by macroeconomic policy, and bad lending caused by the nature of management, or the nature of the public sector banks and financial institutions, who just don't have the autonomy, and therefore, however good those managers are, they're forced into many of these kind of lending. Now, add to that these things, the credit rationing, monetary conservatism, which I already talked about, weakened contracting of the you know, contracting by the BSFS, demoralization of the bank managers. There's a tremendous delay in shoring up the net worth of the BSFIs for the recovery. What the government should have done, it did 3 years or 2.5 years later, over which time there was complete demoralization of the financial sector. Okay. Yeah. So right. So this is something which we need to consider. Yeah. So there were other governance measures which were hurtful. Okay, arbitrary knee-jerk reactions, and when I say governance, even the courts are included, because the court had earlier responded, remember, in 11-12 to the mining kind of problem by banning mining, banning sand mining, banning coal mining, banning and banning. So this knee-jerk arbitrary reaction of the courts plus the government, okay, has been part of the problem. Okay, now, in a world where the growth has slowed down, okay, nominal GDP, real growth is under 5, let's say around 5. Inflation core is about 4.5, 5. So you really have a nominal GDP growth of no more than 9.5, 10%. Okay? But if the tax targets are still stuck at 15 and they are unrelenting on the tax department, the tax department turns parasitic initially on the PSUs. And this had been happening even before, the present government, even during the Congress regime for quite some time. And the present government, when it came to power, and Mr. Jaitley, Arun Jaitley actually promised that tax terrorism will go away. And I think he understood it very well. However, what happened is, because the targets continued to be unrelenting, now the tax authorities are even become not just parasitic on the PSUs, demanding all kinds of illegitimate revenues to be coughed up before the March 31st, only to be given back, with all kinds of pain. But now that kind of tax terrorism is being exercised on, even the private sector. Okay, and there's a lot of raids and so on, which have gone on, which have terrorized or brought down the animal spirits. Okay, above all, there has been misalignment between macroeconomic demand, structural reform, between trade and industrial policy. Let's say there's a Make in India. However, when you look at the tariffs, they are anything but supportive of Make in India and electronics. So there is this kind of misalignment, and also recognize that great reform, in the form of GST, okay, can actually be demand depressionary in the short run, but great in the long run. So, and once you recognize that, you can counter that demand depressionary effect with appropriate, measures. That kind of thinking was not there. Okay. Then again, when you said bans, for instance, when you said all diesel vehicles will be banned, okay, you created tremendous uncertainty in the auto sector, and in a lot of other things, because even the countries which are vehemently pursuing electric, they have never said that they're going to ban it. So ban creates a situation where markets are unable to deal with it and price it. Okay. However, incentives, very strong incentives for electric, very strong disincentives for diesel, are all fine because markets are able to price it. Okay. Whereas here, markets are not able to price it, therefore it gets translated to a fear and to what we call an increase in the business uncertainty, besides the financial uncertainty. So there were two elements of this uncertainty. One is the RBI contributing to it, the other is the government contributing to it. And net, the overall uncertainty went so high that the animal spirits were down. And remember, investment, that means what companies spend to create capital assets, after 11, 12, has simply not taken place in India. Okay, Now that's a long period of almost 7.5 to 8 years. So you can well imagine if the economy revives, what will happen? Okay, what could happen? Okay, but more importantly, it's really low down, and to pick up anything like animal spirits right now would be, you need to strategize, sequence, and so on and so forth. Okay, yeah. So now let's look at the GCC and the response. To it. That's the great global COVID crisis, or the great COVID crisis, whichever way you want to call it. Okay. Yeah, one is still to see a meaningful response from the RBI. When I say meaningful, which is addressed at the problem and addressed as a policy maker, not as if I'm the bank, I'm the ordinary bank. Okay. See, even AAA bonds have been affected. Okay. The RBI is hardly acted on its own balance sheet. It's still using the repo window instead of using the OMO. Okay. In fact, direct lending RBI on its balance sheet is on the cards, but it has not yet come out with it. Hopefully, it will. I'm sure. You know, little or no reverse sterilize. I think this is extremely important. I already talked about it. And this is not the first time that the RBI was failing. During the global financial crisis, when again the FIIs quit, and they quit very suddenly, not so spaced out. The central banker was caught with his pants down. What he should have done is increase the liquidity by raising by doing OMO, that what we call reverse sterilization, to buy bonds, so that domestic credit kind of matches up and the H, or high powered money, is not allowed to fall. But he didn't do it. And finally, he just sat on it and had to be told by the government, which then had the right ideas and, got it done. So again, similarly now, when the quit has happened, you don't see a quick enough reverse sterilization which is going on, or a complete sterilization. There is some reverse sterilization. Okay. Now, corporate bond yields are, of course, even higher. I talked about transmission velocity would fall precipitously in such a situation, because in a situation of uncertainty, the demand for liquidity goes up all over the world, and unless you serve that liquidity, you can't overcome it. Okay. Now, look at it from the bond. So, what the RBI has come out with, what I would call a vacuous payments moratorium. Okay. It doesn't help, it only enhances the risk that banks or intermediaries face and makes them behave in altogether terrible ways. Okay. So that's not what the central banker could have come out with. The central banker merely followed the government into this moratorium business. But the government doing a moratorium business was okay. Okay. And I don't think it added one bit positive to the situation of the financial. It only worsened. Okay. But of course, the Indian financial markets are hugely positive in the sense of participants, and they have great hope that these would be corrected. Okay. So yeah, so there is this vacuous payments moratorium based, attempt. Okay. What the central banker could have done and should have done, and this is universal knowledge, I'm not just a guy saying it, everybody who say it, was, to actually intervene on its own balance sheet directly. Now, payments moratorium at best is relevant whose assets are backed by value, there would be a resolution was required. Still in the door. Unless that is resolved, I don't think we're going to go anywhere. So that's also waiting. Okay. Now let's turn to the government. Here again, one observes a certain kind of mindset or a problem inside. What is that problem? There is a family budget, fiscal space, restraint orientation, which says, which poses, I think, rather meaningless questions in the current context. Where is the fiscal space? Kind of thing. You know, shouldn't be tight. If you look at some of the initiatives of the government, it's actually too tight. Okay. Now it's like, let's say you and me, what should we do in a crisis like that? As a family, I must tight. As a business, I must tight. Tight meaning kind of stop spending on anything other than strictly required and so on. Marshal my resources. But government should do exactly the opposite. This is the fallacy of competition. That's what basic macro tells you. It has told us all the way from the basic Keynesian insight. So government should have that framework of not make people behave. And that can in the announcement of that is only reworked. Additional expenditure is only about 0.5% of GDP, which I have calculated. Uh, Minimum on day one, anybody would have said that it should be 2.5%. Most economists today will talk about a minimum 5% of GDP as the crisis week goes in. And as it becomes worse and worse, will require a bigger and bigger thrust. Okay. With the passage of time, you know, and entrenched negative spirits, uh, the monetary measures, while necessary, would be completely inconsequential in pushing up the demand. It would have to be fiscal. And that puts actually a greater burden on the government, okay, because of the delays. Now, let's look at the lockdowns. One is at one level, highly appreciative of the lockdowns because it shows a sense of the concern. However, you know, uh, it is it is more based on administrative boundaries and a complete ignorance of articulations which are already there in the economy. It's based on a middle class kind of view. Suppose if I was middle class, you lock me down and allow me to buy food. Okay, I'm not paying because I'm getting a salary. In fact, I have a good life on campus. But everybody is not in that situation. Okay, and that's not the way to look at productive entity. So we have reached a point where, with this extensive lockdown, we have ruined the production capacity. So, we should have actually looked at distancing versus lockdowns, and not at territorial movement restrictions. The most ludicrous you can see is in Delhi. Delhi is one integrated place. Everybody knows that. But the laws are different between the boundaries of UP and Delhi and Delhi and Haryana. Okay. And I'm told that people have started even constructing trenches in rural areas, outside their villages, outside their districts, aptly encouraged by government lower level functionaries of the government. So when the revival takes place, I don't know how we are going to relink all this. Okay. And of course, by now, the migrant labor market fiasco is there. Very early on, some of us tried to warn the government that, look, the first thing to do is to let out money so that at every construction site and industrial site where there are migrant workers, continue the work to the extent possible, and if not, pay them so that they stay there and put in distance. But, you know, workers, where it takes like so there is a complete labor market. Lost. I will. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. 1 minute. No? Okay. Yeah, apparently my voice was lost, so I will just say something very briefly on the territorial aspect of those lockdowns. Okay, first of all, they ignored the interaction which is required, and which, at least at a certain minimal level, that should have been maintained. Okay, then in India, a lockdown helps you to gear up the medical system, nothing more. Okay, because there are three levels at least. One is the metros and others which are in contact globally. Second level, which is in contact with these metros, and the third level, which is in contact only much later. So India is like three layers of countries, in one. Once you recognize that, you know that you are in for a long COVID crisis. So, hopes that, well, you have a 1 month lockdown and things will be fine are all absolute nonsense. You are going to live with it, and you have to create systems. And the most appropriate of the most crucial of that system is the medical system. How do I mobilize and enhance the number of doctors, nurses, and so on by 5 times? During the lockdown, government should have done it. It didn't. So now it's running from pillar to post. Something is happening. Positive, of course. So ignoring this 3 or 4 level hierarchy of its urban places and regions, is a problem. And then of course the migrant labor fiasco. Okay. So these have happened. Okay. So I will kind of, you know, uh, maybe I'll just run through, or maybe I'll just stop here for a while because there's just 5 more minutes for it's 40 minutes have passed, and I'll have the questions, and then I'll go on to what I think would be the measures which need to be taken into account. Okay. Yeah. So any quick questions?
Professor Devinder here. You just told about India is a 3-layered country. Can you explain it again? I could not follow.
Sebastian, your voice is lost again. There is some problem. And those who are listening on YouTube can, send your questions on chat if you're not able to comment, because it seems that, I'm not able to enable the comment right now.
Hi, Professor Morris. This is Utsav Mishra. So I work with EY. One of my questions is, you talked about, the economic stimulus, that is required, and upwards of, 2.5% of the GDP. Till now we have only seen only about 1% of the GDP being earmarked as a stimulus. While if you look at Canada, it's giving a stimulus of about 12 to 13% of the GDP, and some countries are even thinking of doing more to an upwards of 20 or even 30%. So my question is, what do you think, is the right amount of stimulus, that should be required, to kind of rejuvenate the economy? And secondly, how, from where would it be financed? Will it be financed through debt? Considering, our debt to GDP ratio is not that bad compared to, other countries. And countries like Japan, they have survived, perennially on debt.
Sebastian, you're on mute. Unmute yourself. Yeah, now you can speak.
Yeah. So a couple more questions, and then I go on to answer. Okay. A couple more questions, and then I can answer. Yeah.
So Manjula here. One question is, one of the point is that India has a very poor ranking in terms of, we are just ranked at BBB in terms of our investment grade. So how does this affect our ability to infuse liquidity into the system?
Yeah.
Also,
yeah, Manjula.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Also, what's the other one?
Yeah, and one more question is, sir, currently our exports is about like 20% of our GDP. Now this whole COVID thing is going to affect our export severely, and there will be a corresponding foreign exchange impact too. So, I mean, what will be the solution to, kind of mitigate that problem?
Okay. One more, and then I'll...
Yeah, Professor Morris, I have one more question. Do you think, cutting individual taxes, rather than corporate taxes is a better, move, and the government should do that rather than cutting corporate taxes?
Yeah. Okay. So let me start by, responding, you see, and given the shortage of time, I can only use an analogy. See, we are not in a situation where the demand has come down and you need to restore it. That's not just it. That goes without saying, but you won't be able to restore it fully. Okay. So a fall in the output of, let us say, the order of 5%, 8%, and so on is inevitable. Okay. The question is whether I can limit it to, let's say, 6% or so. Okay, 5% or so. So I think if we can limit the fall in GDP to about 5% at the end of the year, that is a growth of -5%, I think we should all be very happy and thankful. Okay. See, what is not getting realized is it's much, much more severe. Okay. So in effect, what one is saying is, if the right measures... my voice okay, Sanjay? So if the right measures are not taken now, it's already a little too late. The financial system would collapse. Okay, and once the financial system collapses, you don't have a payments mechanism.
Hello.
Almost on the verge. Another month. Yeah.
Hello.
Yeah. Hello.
Good afternoon, sir. I'm Dr. Prasanna Ganeshan from Chennai. I just have one question to ask. What is the state of job crisis for white collar job people?
Okay. Okay. I got it. Yeah. So I get where all these are coming from. Okay. So I was trying to attempt to give a kind of perspective on it. Okay. So imagine that there is a pipe through which water is flowing at a certain rate. Okay? It's inevitable that the water will flow at a lower rate. Okay. The question is, if the government acts correctly, the water rate, instead of falling to a
Sebastian,
trickle.
now I will put Sebastian. I will put everyone on mute now.
Yeah. Please. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So what I'm saying is, it's no longer a question of how much water will flow through. It is. Okay. But it's also a question. Okay. So a pure liquidity crisis becomes a solvency issue, and the solvency issue becomes a bankruptcy issue. And in many sectors, it has gone past the bankruptcy issue. Okay. Once you have that, there can also be a collapse. Okay. So what has happened? So it's much deeper. So at this stage, you don't ask questions about fiscal deficit. You don't, because there is none. There may not be an economy left to even talk about it. You don't talk about questions of rating and ranking. See, all ratings, all rankings are thrown out of the window. What basis do they go? I mean, if you have done any ranking, there is simply nothing. It's your ranking versus mine. Okay. So they would take time before they get on some kind of a sensible wicket. Okay. Right now, the crisis is, how do I prevent a collapse of the logistics system, and how do I prevent a collapse of the production system? Okay, number one for the government, and also how do I bring back demand? So let me put the whole thing in perspective by suggesting what could be the measures. Okay, so urgently required measures, I would think, are to lift all these lockdowns. Okay, because in India they have served no purpose, because they are territorial rather than functional. Okay, and the government of India is incapable of acting functionally; it can only act territorially. So I think the physical distancing is the way forward, with the role of government and NGOs and police and so on. So we should go for a rational approach to vending. Irrationality has actually led to massive increases in the spread. Okay, so a silly thing that all government officials will do is, okay, let's minimize the interaction. So the shops are open only for 2 hours. Now, if you open the shops for only 2 hours, there's going to be crowding and spreading, and that's exactly what happened. Okay, so all the benefit potentially which we could have had in the lockdown round 1 and 2 were exhausted when we opened up and had this irrationality, because the lockdown is seen as something administrative, not as something functional. Okay, the police are incapable of seeing it, the functionality in it. They'll only see the law, the rule. Okay, so open by default, except, and open by default, closed only by exception. Again, the zoning is of no consequence, because the zonings are absurd when they are 7 kilometers long. Okay, in radius, it doesn't help at all. It just slows down. Okay, so intervention, including now what is required urgently. Okay? Rationing framework must be in place, because soon enough, once the stocks are over in the cities, you will be running from pillar to post to buy things. Okay, and you need a rationing solution. Okay? Agricultural products, particularly perishables, may waste. It's already beginning to happen. They may not reach the cities because the intervening aspect is not there. Okay, so now this whole essential, non-essential is pure nonsense in the mind of a policeman. There is no way he can judge the causation or the line of logistics. Okay, so you have to simply remove all the current lockdowns and create now closures or restrictions based on exception, and put in place massive social distancing approaches where you can even take people. So rationing of food is absolutely required. You know, Yeah, along with some solution for perishable. And soon enough, I think government would face the task of bringing back the logistics system. Okay? So the collapsed logistics would have to be required. That will take time. Of course, on the medical side, I'm not the expert, but one can say that we need massive gear up on the medical side, and all this I'm basing on all the doctors, including Guleria, who said the same thing in the newspaper yesterday, that to improve the healthcare and sanitation, integral movement of the organized private sector in subsidiaries, integrated approach of the private and public sector in healthcare. Now, bringing back migrants, I'm not saying, but everybody has said it. I said it on day one that look, you need a solution to keep the migrants at the construction site, industrial estates, at the industrial clusters, and with let them work. Where they can't, you still keep them, but physically distance. Where they can't, but work in close distance.
Listen, your voice is losing again.
Says
No,
that
yeah, better.
working, keep them working, and use now NGOs to work with the companies, work with the MSMEs, work with the clusters, and so on, so that they are physically distanced, and they don't suffer those dangers. Okay, so that is extremely important. In other words, opening up. Okay, and I think the private sector needs to be involved hugely in the medical side as well. Okay, and I've already talked about an urban REGS, UREGS. Okay, to keep the workers in the urban areas, supported by massive government outflow. So the time has come to extend NREGs to the urban areas, to industrial estates, to construction sites. Okay, so that you can keep the workers there, even if they are not engaged in productive activity. Okay, which are of high productivity. And obviously, the private sector can't do this unless they are energized enabled through a policy of subsidy and so on and so forth. Okay, now, the RBI's core mandate is not inflation fighting in a situation. There's no inflation, or there is absurdity of when you talk of inflation, because there'll be multiple inflation once the logistics system breaks down. You could have rock bottom prices in rural areas and rock high prices in urban areas. Okay, so there can't be inflation fighting as its mandate. Okay, so RBI's mandate is to hold the functionality of the financial sector and the payments mechanism, and any damage to that it must repair, even if it means doing massive OMOs, okay, expanding its balance sheets, OMOs, and asset purchase. All NBFCs need to be shored up. This is not the time to figure out whether a rascal, headed it and was attempting to divert funds. If you want, knock his head off, take over all the NBFCs, manage them for a while, bring in other worthy private sector to manage it, and then worry about, whom to punish if that was the case. Okay. Now the problem with RBI is it has been putting itself not in the policymaker's shoes, but it has been pretending as if it's a bank. So what a bank needs to do, which is socially valuable, the RBI tells them to do that. Okay. Now why should the bank do it? Why should you and me do what is socially valuable? Okay. We will do what is privately profitable for us if you are in businesses. Okay. So a bank will shore it, will tighten, will not lend, will park all its money in repos, will park all its money in government bonds. Okay, and it's not going to lend in with this heightened uncertainty till the rates come down, till actually the RBI now solves the problem of reducing the risk. Okay, so that has to be understood, that the RBI refuses to understand that it's in a policy position and not in a managerial position. Okay, this is a tragedy of policymakers in India. Okay, we of course need a specific resolution for real estate infrastructure and construction. And soon enough, if at all the economy picks up, there is going to be massive recapitalization requirement of the banks. There's no doubt about it. Okay. Yeah. Advancement from demand and supply shocks to the payments mechanism, to articulation and logistics, and to capacity distribution. So, as the crisis has progressed in India, it has gone all the way. The only thing that it has not done so far is capacity destruction. Another 2 weeks, and this is going to happen. Okay. Elsewhere in the world, it has only resulted in demand destruction, supply shocks, and marginally affected the payments mechanism, which has been reversed in at least the advanced countries. There is no destruction of articulation or logistics, and there is certainly no destruction of productivity. Okay, except where the demand will kill it. For instance, in restaurants or travel and so on. Okay, so what kind of fiscal stimulus? I would say that, massive fiscal stimulus is required, but minimally for a government which is still like a accountant, looking at khata and behaving as if it's a family, a minimum 2.5%. Okay. Now, what should this fiscal stimulus take? See, this is not the time to worry about whether a product is luxury, not luxury, required, not required. There are only two approaches. Can it crowd in expenditure? Okay, that's very important. And can it crowd in expenditure of capacities which are idle? Number one. Where would that happen? Where the price elasticity of demand is extremely high. Okay, most notably automobiles and white goods. So today automobiles and white goods are 18, 28%, etc. The time has come to bring it down to about 10, 15%. In fact, at this level, if you keep it at 28%, your revenue realization on account of auto, GST, will be tiny in relation to what you can get if you reduce it to 10, 15%. So what I'm suggesting is bring down the auto GST to 10 or 15%, preferably 10, and say that this GST will be valid over the next year, the coming year, from now onwards for a year. So remember, you're putting consumers, you're giving now an option to consumers. Go buy a car or pay 20% duty, when you come back after a year. What will happen? They'll go rush and buy a car. Okay. Now, if that can happen, remember, cars are in idle capacity. The car economy can revive, and that's the best thing to revive the manufacturing sector, because the car and its input-output relations have something like 40% share in total Indian manufacturing. Okay. So this the government must see, and not sit on its haunches and say, hey, cars, luxury, pollution, bring in all those kind of nonsensical ideas at this point in time. Okay. So extensive monetization once rates are below 3.5%. Now, what is the approach to sin taxes? You're already seeing absurd, masochistic policies being put in place by Telangana government. Since people have come out on the streets and they desperately want alcohol, I raise the alcohol taxes at this point in time. You will collect a little amount of money, sure, because people are desperate. Okay. However, if you really want to collect money, you would park the rate at what is called the revenue maximization rate for sin taxes. Okay. So if I'm not saying you do that, but if your idea is to grab money from, get a lot of resources from the liquor and cigarettes, this time may have come to park it at revenue maximizing rates. And revenue maximizing rates would be far lower than even existing rates. Forget about the enhanced rates which these governments are thinking. Okay. Now the government suffers from one major illusion, which is that investment, FDI and FII is equal to spending. It is not. It's a mere financial flow. So I was listening to a senior civil servant who was actually arguing that, look, we are open to investment. So what is the idea? What are you critical about? Yes, you're open to inflows of capital, which is not the same as spending. Okay. And you need investment spending, that means spending on creating capital assets. And that's not going to take place by just opening up on FDI and FII. Okay. Money will come and they'll take over Indian assets. So today the major danger that is happening is, given the huge difference in interest rates between India and abroad, many worthy assets are likely to be taken over for a song in due course by foreigners. Okay, you can see Indian companies who sense this are parking themselves by already forming alliances where the advantage has not yet shifted out from there. The carpet has not been pulled from under them. But if they don't do that, the carpet will be pulled from under, and they're better off simply selling themselves for a song, whether it's Chinese or others. Of course, government can come administratively and say that, look, no China. But can it say no US? Can it say no nobody? Okay? Because then it will be violative of its own stance. Okay? So what it does not realize is that this extreme monetarism is leading to a situation where Indian enterprise will kind of, will have a form. Okay, and I think that becomes important to realize. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Huh. Yeah. So there are some questions which Professor Verma is going to read out. Okay.
Sebastian, there are questions from the participants.
Yeah.
So I will read some of these questions.
Yeah.
For example, someone has asked, do you think printing more money or issuing more bonds? This has also come from YouTube. So printing more money or issuing more bonds, as told by Raghuram Rajan, will be enough. That's one question. Impact of GCC is across all sectors. How can GST relief be sector specific? Another question. Then there is a question also on salary cut. Is it going to aggravate the situation, or should government provide tax relief? There are questions on fiscal deficit. I think that you have answered also. I will read more questions maybe by the time if you answer.
Okay, good. So I think the fiscal deficit question is fair, but we need to understand that, the situation is something like this. Even normally, when you have a recessionary situation, let's say the fiscal deficit was zero in an average situation. And in a recession, it reaches, let's say, minus 1%. That means there's a deficit of 1%. Okay. Now, you see the deficit in a recession and you cut the government expenditure. The fiscal deficit will actually remain at 1% nearly. Okay. But the economy will take a big tumble based on the multiplier. So if every time you see a fiscal deficit, if you start cutting it, you're going to doom the economy. Okay. Now that's very important. This is called the full employment budget surplus argument, which is there in macro 101. Okay. Now pursue that matter a little further and you'll realize that there has to be some kind of moderation to cutting the fiscal deficit. Okay. Fiscal deficit is called for. In India, I would think we must cut the fiscal deficit on a longer time horizon. But right now, given the fiscal crisis, the totality of the crisis, you must allow the fiscal deficit to go up to at least 5%. Okay. And probably monetize another 3-4%. Okay. Monetize meaning the RBI accommodates the borrowing of the government directly on its balance sheet directly without, in that sense. So that must go up, and therefore the balance sheet of the RBI must expand. Besides that, what many are arguing, and I would agree with them, is that central bankers must start buying up worthy AAA rated assets of private companies. This is called quantitative easing, and it was one of the great innovations, in a sense, by central banker, particularly the US and European central bankers, after the global financial crisis, when the bankers had to do the long haul. Okay. And I think the time has come for the Indian RBI to do exactly that, or at least be prepared for it. I think it should do it immediately, because if it can do it and let's say buy up, and I'm being specific here, take financial companies first, which are quite sound. Okay. Look at their asset base and take a value which is equivalent to about maybe 80% of their current or pre-COVID value. Okay, some are going to sink, okay, because they are in the wrong business. They're lending to the wrong business. But many others are not going to sink. Okay. Immediately the RBI can buy up their bonds. Okay. And form an agreement that, look, 5 years down the line, I reserve the right to sell it at profit and not share it. Things like that can be done. Okay. So that's called quantitative easing. So governments are not going to lose. But right now the RBI must support the government. And see, government borrowing, fiscal deficit, if the interest rate, let's say right now is about 4%. Okay. But however, if you can bring the interest rate down to, let's say 3% or 2%, okay, then the government's borrowing cost is also low. So why would all this help? Why would all this be non-inflationary is the point? Because you're operating well below your capacity. Now you will actually make it inflationary by destroying your capacity, and then you'll say now it's going to be inflationary, which I would agree. So 2 years down the line, if you continue the same way, you would have destroyed capacity, and then if you give the fiscal stimulus, you are going to create inflation, believe me. Okay? Because in a standard macro model, that's like affecting the full employment level, full employment capacity, or the capacity of YF. So there is damage to the YF which is possible. And this logistics breakdown, territorialism is actually doing it. So the crisis that the Indian economy faces is huge. Okay? And I don't think a resolution is going to happen, okay, unless the government dramatically changes its thinking. And when I say the government, it's a
Understand on your questions about printing more money.
yeah, printing. Printing is a loose term for RBI's operations. See, when does the RBI print money? It can print, or it can, when it increases the money supply, a certain part of that gets printed. Printing is a subsidiary function. Essentially, when the RBI increases money, it creates money out of thin air. That is iPod. A part of that, which is currency, gets printed. The remaining part goes as, reserves of our member banks in the RBI. Okay. Now, what we are suggesting is there can be a third part, okay, and a fourth part on the other side. Okay. So, in a sense, what you're also saying is on the left side, if you look at it on the asset side. Today, the most important components are domestic credit and NFA. Create a third component which is traditionally called domestic credit. So within domestic credit, create a third component which is buying of the stock and bonds of AAA rated private companies, most crucially in the financial sector, and then move on to other AAA rated companies. When I say AAA, not right now, as they were before, adjusted for some understanding of the COVID crisis. See, you can, without batting your eyelid, say that a AAA rated airline company will not be a AAA rated hotel company is not. However, a AAA rated electricity company will be. A AAA rated automobile company may well be. Okay. Marginal now. So these companies, you can still buy them.
Sebastian, your audio is again giving some trouble. Meanwhile, there is also many questions related to future of MSMEs.
Yeah, the future of MSMEs. I think, I don't know what to say. That's where the major destruction is going to happen. Okay, two reasons. One is that the workers have gone. Okay, many of the workers have gone. Some are hanging around, but their demand, how will it come back? It will have to come back through a very long drawn process. Okay, and when the demand has to come back, the logistics has to come back, all of it has to come back simultaneously. That's why I'm suggesting that no more lockdowns. Open up the economy right now. The more you delay, it's going to be worse. Okay. Now, you might talk in terms of, you might say that, look at this rascal. He's sitting there and he's not.
Sebastian, audio is a problem.
Okay. So, can you hear me now?
Yeah, that's better.
It's better?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm speaking into the computer mic.
That was better.
Better?
That
okay.
is better.
So, now let me just say, that you might think that, look, one is not bothered about lives. Okay. Here, I think 2 points need to be recognized. And I don't think the debate has started in India yet on this point. See, actually, how many people die in India every year? About 8 to 9 million people. Okay, which is the population of a fairly small to medium-sized country, of which about half are infants, children, and so on and so forth. Okay, and these numbers die. Now, that 8 million on a daily basis is something humongously large relative to what COVID can ever kill. Okay, I'm not saying balance life with life. I'm saying something else. Okay, let's have a correct perspective. On many of those, you can actually act to prevent. For instance, with the Swachh Bharat, which actually works, with a clean environment, so many of the infant mortality, maternal mortality, and all that with better vaccination can be reduced. So they are actionable. Okay, if there is a public ethics focus on that, whereas this is a global crisis, you can't act. It's God-given. There's only a limited point to which you can act. So on something which you can't act, you want to focus all your attention. While on something which you can act, because it's not drawing in eyeballs, the middle class doesn't care. I don't think it's a problem of this government or that government. This is a problem of the middle class. The middle class wants to see the COVID crisis in terms of a lockdown. I am happy. I live in a gated community. I close the gates and I think I'm protected. While you do that, the entire basis of existence is being destroyed in the country. Okay, that is what we need to recognize. Okay, so if you take that perspective, okay, you would say, look, some 50,000 deaths are 10,000 to 50,000. I don't know how much it will be, are going to happen. Let me try and minimize it. How do I do it? Make an honest attempt. Okay, let's enhance the medical services, do the very best in terms of distancing, because more than lockdowns, it's distancing that is important. Sanitary and distancing. Do it, but let the economy be. Okay? Because remember, unlike in the Western world, there they can assume actually that we are all middle class. So any American who's in pain is appearing on the unemployment register on day one. All he has to do is, the moment he loses the job, go and sign up, fill in a form, and he appears on the unemployment. Thereby, they are showing an unemployment of 24 million or whatever, which is roughly of the order of 15% and so on. My sense is they'll reach about 30% unemployment, okay, which would be similar to that of the Great Depression. But what about in India? We have already reached a situation where, if you consider those who were fruitfully employed in India, forget those who are not fruitfully employed, we may have halved it already, if not below that. Okay. So the matter is much more serious. So the people who can pretend that they are middle class and can actually take in a large lockdown, okay, seemingly based on a micro logic, even that is not correct. Based on a micro logic, is some 10-15% of the population who are the visible people in urban areas, maybe 20%. Okay, so there is a huge non-poor who contribute greatly, working class, who are entirely migrant or largely migrant. Okay, and many of them are not migrants, but most are migrants, who stand to lose heavily. And when they lose, remember, with a delay, it's going to hit us. Okay, we would have a significant, and if that cycle happens, and if the government is unable to handle that, you could have a destruction of capacity, as I said, and the GDP fall of 5 or 10%. You would be happy if that was all. I mean, we could easily have a GDP fall of 20-25% and go on like that for a while. Okay.
One cross question is there that someone has asked that, do you think people in our country are educated, literate, and understanding enough that they will maintain social distance if these so-called temporary rules are removed? That is one.
I can't hear you, but I guess it's a question about, are we educated enough to practice social distancing correctly?
Yes. Okay. Yes.
See, the point is, always pose it against an alternative. Let's assume that people are not educated and they're not going to practice social distance. Okay. Does a lockdown then help? Let's say you have a lockdown.
Yeah,
you have to open up after a week so that they can buy purchases.
Okay.
So think rationally. I mean, pose what the alternative is. Okay. So it's not a knee-jerk words based. It's not at the level of a word. Lockdown versus, as if there is no long-term feasibility to lockdown, because we are in a modern economy. We are not in an agrarian economy. See, often you'll say Kerala has done wonderfully well. Yes, in many ways it has done wonderfully well. And I think one should compliment the medical system, the government, and so on. But remember, the Kerala solution in itself, while it needs to be adopted elsewhere, cannot be the full solution, because there is hardly any non-tradable goods production, tradable services production in Kerala. So, a completely agrarian economy can lock itself up. Okay. An economy where people, or a homestead, where people stay in homesteads and distantly. There are very few flats in Kerala, and all are upper class, middle class kind of flats. All others stay in households. So the scope for meeting each other and passing on germs is much less. Okay. In India, some of our cities like Mumbai have, in the slums, and not just in the slums, but about 70% of the people, 60 to 70%, live in 8% of the space in Bombay. Okay. So you're talking of a density which is at least 8 times that of what is observed in any other slum anywhere else in the world other than in South Asia. Okay. It is that low a level of space. So you're absolutely right. Forget about education. The entire gamut of being so very close would prevent any strategy based on trying to build barriers for the virus. Okay. You've reached a ridiculous level, pushing this lockdown. look around you, you will hear of districts, talukas, villages, city boundaries, small urban towns, where they're already digging trenches around the roads so that the trucks can't move in or cars can't come in. Because they're saying, how do we monitor? People have, like, you are gated, like the middle class has taken control over gated communities. The older folk in these middle class communities have taken control and prevented any movement in Pune and so on. Similarly, in villages, they are also responding with this kind of irrational.
Sebastian, there is a counter argument that someone has written, USA didn't implement lockdown with literate people, but the number of casualties have rose exponentially high.
Yeah, I mean, I can see where it's coming from. What you're saying is, I didn't hear the question that the number of deaths in India are fewer than elsewhere and is likely to be so. Okay, I fully agree. Okay, that may well be a result of not so much of the lockdown. Lockdown would have helped, I'm sure, in the beginning, but also of the fact that, you know, Indians, normally any Indian when tested has a huge number of antibodies, antigens and antibodies in that. So that's because we are exposed to disease. So there could be reasons, you know, which we don't know. And well, those help us take the fullest advantage of that. But what I'm saying is, soon enough, we are going to see more deaths because of livelihood losses and lack of medical facilities or lack of medical approach. But anyway, my point was not to discuss that side, but to discuss, even if you practice lockdown, what is required to bring the system back. Okay, if at all you can do it.
There have been questions related to the changes in labor law that have been made in states like UP.
Yeah, see, I have very little to say about that. I can't hear you. That's why, you know, let me just put this back.
Maybe you should put your audio on high volume, because you are perfect without this headset. Sorry.
See, again, yeah, what you're saying is, what about the changes in labor laws? Am I right, Sanjay?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so some of the states have changed the labor laws. Again, they're looking at it from one side. What is it? That if you make the laws liberal, enterprise will employ more people. But remember, enterprise is going to employ people when there's a demand, when the labor is there. Okay, so how do I ensure all three is my point? And you don't need this wrong signal to be sent to workers, you know, that look, whatever little rights they had are being taken away. And you think, you know, labor flexibility was India's problem? You can throw out a worker any day. You can throw out even an IT person any day. You can throw out a senior manager in a service company any day. Okay. Today, when I say much before the COVID crisis, maybe as much as 10 years before, you know, something like 40% of all government employees could have been kicked out on any day because they were all tempies. 40% of Maruti workers are tempies, are contract employees. So what are we trying to say? That labor market rigidity stands in the way of India's, you know, employment? That's pure nonsense. You know, when something like 60% of India's labor force is, you know, what we call subject to disguised unemployment. Okay.
Sebastian, one more question, last question I would put to you, which people are asking about, you know, many of them will be interested, is stock market.
Yeah.
So impact of this on the stock market, and especially when market is, you know, gaining more numbers after that 26,000.
I think that requires some discussion. You see, the Western world, including the US, has shown a V-shaped recovery of the stock market, but everybody is convinced that the economy will go through a U-shaped recovery at best. And when it recovers, it's not going to be very great. Okay? Because two of their most important sectors, they are huge in the Western context, namely travel and tourism and airlines and so on, are going to get badly, and dining, etc., are going to get badly affected. Now, what explains this puzzle? The answer is simple. Okay? Suppose if I put the same uncertainty as was there before the COVID crisis, which was low. Okay. And what was the discount rate, the interest rate on a 10-year bond? It was X. Okay. Let's say 2% or something. Okay. Now it has fallen to less than 1%. So all assets would be valued at more than double the rates, including stocks and bonds and so on. But the uncertainty has also gone up. Therefore, the assets are being valued not at 2 times, but at half what it used to be. Okay. And therefore, since the interest rates have fallen, the value is being restored. You got the point? So valuation of an asset is a function of 2 things. Okay. 3 things actually: earnings, the discount rate and the uncertainty. Okay, what has happened is the earnings has gone. Everybody expects a moderation to the earnings, except in the case of tech, stocks. So Nasdaq has gone up first. Okay, so tech stocks, let's say, have no earning impairment. Okay, other stocks, S&P will have some impairment, but not all the stocks. Maybe about a third of all the stocks, directly and indirectly, through the collapse of tourism, transport, etc. I mean, those kind of business. Okay, so there is an earnings impairment. However, this huge 1 trillion dollars of infusion, okay, and the forward guidance and the monetary policies of the central bank have ensured that the discount rate is now half that of the earlier discount rate. So when the discount rate halves, the valuation goes up, because the value of a stock is E, if it's a constant earnings, E by R minus G. Okay, so G has had an impairment, so the value should come down. E has had an impairment, okay, but not E, the I minus, so it's E by I minus G. I has had a fall, huge fall, therefore the value would go up. You get it? But it's not going up as much as one would think, because from a simple model, because the uncertainties have gone up. So if the uncertainties now fall as we look forward, the US stock market may actually go above its level, pre-crisis level, because so much of liquidity enhancement has taken place. Okay. Now, when that happens, there may be a liquidity flow into India as well, in the search of higher return, which may hold up the stock market in all those assets which are not going to get impaired. Okay, so it's a likely possibility. Now, if the government does right and gets the financial sector up and going, okay, the financial sector which has been beaten down, okay, for instance, if the RBI really starts operating on its own balance sheet, the Indian financial sector will zoom, okay, will really zoom, okay, and may actually achieve well above its pre-credit policy, with the pre-COVID rates. So yes, the stock market behavior is different today globally from what it is before the global financial crisis, because a new policy instrument has come in, namely enhanced liquidity and forward guidance. So what is forward guidance? The central banker convinces the market that if 1% is the interest rate, for the next so many years, I'm not going to change the interest rate. Okay. And when that conviction is there, the uncertainty falls. The uncertainty measure falls. And when that happens, the stocks go up. Okay. So remember, in a world where the return to capital has fallen, okay, elevated stock prices, which are reflective of elevated asset prices, are part of the day. So that in itself doesn't tell you that the market is going to do that the economy is going to do very well. Okay. However, if that does not happen, you're pretty sure that the economy is not good. You get the point?
There are many more questions, but I think we'll have to call it now. There are at least 50 more questions. Therefore, maybe sometime later we'll call you again.
Sure. I mean, yeah.